In ancient Greece, the road to the underworld was blocked by a dog with 3 heads, chained at the gate of the dead, allowing every soul to enter and none to leave. Half a world away, in the sacred texts of ancient Iran, the newly dead crossed a narrow bridge over an abyss, and waiting at both ends stood a pair of dogs, each with 4 eyes, who alone could judge whether the soul was fit to cross. And on the other side of an ocean no ancient Persian or Greek ever knew existed, the Aztecs of Mexico taught that every soul faced a wide black river on its journey to the land of the dead, and the only being who could guide it safely across wore the head of a dog. 3 unconnected civilizations, separated by continents, and, in one case, by an ocean that would not be crossed by any human being for another 1,000 years. And all 3 placed the exact same animal at the exact same job. Tonight we count the rest. The number, by the most conservative scholarly tally, is at least 40. You are listening to the Nyx Codex, and tonight's investigation is not about one god. It is about one office, a single position that appears, filled again and again by different names in different tongues, at the one threshold every human civilization has ever had to imagine, the border of death itself. Every previous entry in this codex has traced a single figure across geography, one goddess following the trade roads, one god buried beneath a change of religion. Tonight the method is different, because the pattern itself is different. We are not asking whether one being traveled. We are asking why dozens of civilizations that never met, never traded, and in most cases never even knew of each other's existence, all arrived independently at the same answer to the same question: who watches the gate? And before we count a single culture toward that number, the file needs a rule, because a claim like 40 cultures is exactly the kind of number that gets thrown around loosely in documentaries and never checked. So here is the standard tonight's investigation holds itself to. A tradition only counts if it is attested in a primary text, an inscription, an archaeological burial practice, or a documented ethnographic record, not a modern retelling or a website's unsourced list. And every match has to clear a second, harder test. We have to ask whether the resemblance comes from a real historical connection, a shared ancestor language, a documented trade route, a recorded conquest, or whether the cultures in question could not possibly have influenced one another at all. Those 2 categories are going to turn out to require 2 completely different explanations, and keeping them separate is the only way tonight's number means anything. The answer to that question splits, once you examine it closely, into 2 entirely separate mysteries, one explainable by ordinary history, and one that is not. We begin with the family that history can explain. Layer 1, the family tree. Not every match across ancient religions is a coincidence, and the honest place to begin is with the cases where the resemblance is not a mystery at all, because the cultures in question share a genuine common ancestor. Consider 3 guardians. In Greek myth, Cerberus, the 3-headed hound, sits chained at the gate of Hades, and the poet Hesiod describes him plainly. A dog, brazen-voiced, 50-headed in the oldest layer of the tradition. In the Vedic hymns of ancient India, composed in Sanskrit more than 3,000 years ago, the god of the dead, Yama, keeps 2 dogs of his own, named Shyama and Sabala, each described as 4-eyed and broad-nosed, who roam among men as messengers of death, and who guard the path the dead must walk to reach their master's hall. And in the sacred books of ancient Persia, the Zoroastrian scriptures describe the Chinvat bridge, the crossing every soul must make after death, narrowing to the width of a blade edge for the wicked, and widening for the just, and guarding that crossing, again, a pair of 4-eyed dogs, whose gaze alone determines whether a soul may pass. These 3 traditions, Greek, Vedic Indian, and Zoroastrian Iranian, are not coincidences, and scholars have known why for well over a century. All 3 languages, Greek, Sanskrit, and Avestan Persian, descend from a single ancestral tongue linguists, called Proto-Indo-European, spoken by a prehistoric population somewhere on the Eurasian steppe, thousands of years before any of these civilizations existed as we know them. When that population split apart and its descendants carried their language in different directions, eventually becoming Greeks and Persians and the people of the Indian subcontinent, they carried their religion with them too, and the myths drifted apart the way the languages did, staying similar enough that comparative scholars can still trace the themes. The Rig Veda itself, one of the oldest religious texts on earth, preserves a funeral hymn that addresses the two Dobs of Yama directly, asking them to look kindly on the departing soul and let it pass safely along the road. Their master guards, a prayer recited over the dead thousands of years before Athens or Persepolis existed, already assuming the audience knew exactly which two Dobs were meant. The linguist and historian of religion Bruce Lincoln, examining exactly this cluster in the 20th century, laid out the shared architecture directly. The dog or dogs, the four eyes, the guarding of a boundary between the living and the dead, appearing in Greek, Vedic and Iranian sources with a consistency too precise to be accidental invention. Even the names cooperate. The Vedic god of death, Yama, and the legendary first man of Iranian myth, Yima, are, by the sober judgment of linguists, one and the same word in two daughter languages, split from a single ancestor, exactly the way English brother and Sanskrit brata split from the same ancient root. So, when Cerberus, Shyama and Sabala, and the dogs of the Chinvat bridge all show up guarding death with four watching eyes between them, that is not 40 independent cultures discovering the same idea. That is one very old idea, inherited, like a family heirloom, by three cultures descended from a common ancestor, exactly the way three cousins might all inherit the same grandmother's ring. Greek myth, worth noting, kept the same threshold job open for more than one occupant, because alongside Cerberus stood Charon, the ferryman who rowed the dead across the river Styx for the price of a coin placed under the tongue, and Hermes in his separate office as Psychopomp, the literal Greek term meaning guide of souls, who escorted the newly dead down to the riverbank in the first place. A dog to guard the gate, a boatman to cross the water, and a divine messenger to walk the soul there. Three separate offices in one tradition, all clustered around the same terrifying administrative problem, and every later culture on tonight's list would end up solving that same problem with some combination of the same three roles. This family alone accounts for a meaningful slice of the 40, but it does not account for most of them, and the moment you leave this family tree behind, the mystery gets considerably stranger. Layer 2, the impossible echoes. Here is where the investigation stops being explainable and starts being genuinely uncanny, because we now leave the Indo-European family entirely and walk into civilizations that had no shared ancestor, no shared language, and in most cases no conceivable contact with the ones we have already examined, and we find, sitting at the same threshold, doing the same job, the same animal all over again. Begin in ancient Egypt, a civilization with zero linguistic or cultural relationship to Greece, India, or Iran in its formative religious period. At the gate of the Egyptian afterlife stands Anubis, depicted with the head of a jackal, a wild canine of the desert edge, and his job description reads like a direct translation of the job we have already seen twice. He guides the newly dead through the underworld. He stands watch at the necropolis, the literal city of the dead, and above all, he presides over the weighing of the heart, the ceremony in which the dead person's heart is placed on a scale against the feather of truth. And if the heart is heavier, weighted down with wrongdoing, it is devoured on the spot by a monster called Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, and the soul ceases to exist. A canine guardian of the threshold, standing at the exact same job as Cerberus and the dogs of Yama, in a civilization whose earliest religious texts predate any meaningful contact with Indo-European speaking peoples by well over 1,000 years. And Egypt did not stop at one canine guardian. Alongside Anubis stood a second jackal-headed god, Wepwayet, whose very name is usually translated as Opener of the Ways, worshipped as the deity who marched at the head of funeral processions and cleared the road for the dead into the afterlife, a separate office from Anubis, but built from the same animal, doing recognizably the same class of work. a road opener standing beside a gatekeeper, as if one canine alone were not considered sufficient to cover the whole threshold. Cross an ocean now, to a civilization that had, as far as any archaeologist has ever established, no contact whatsoever with Egypt, Greece, India, or Iran. In the highlands of central Mexico, the Aztecs described the journey of the dead as a 4-year passage through 9 distinct trials before the soul reached Mictlan, the land of the dead, and the 4th of those trials was a wide, dangerous river with no bridge, the river the Aztecs called Chiconahuapan. No human being could cross it alone. The soul required a guide, and that guide was Xolotl, a god depicted with the head of a dog, twin brother of the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl. Aztec myth even ties Xolotl directly into the story of how humanity itself was made, recounting how Quetzalcoatl traveled into the underworld to steal the bones of an earlier destroyed race of humans in order to create the current one, and Xolotl accompanied him on that descent as his guide and protector through the land of the dead. A role that made him, by the time the myth turns to ordinary human souls, the obvious escort for every death that followed, since he was already the one being in the pantheon who had proven he could walk into that country and come back out again. And this belief was not confined to myth alone. Archaeologists have recovered burials across Mesoamerica in which a small breed of dog, the Xoloitzcuintli, was interred alongside its human owner, killed and buried specifically so that its spirit could accompany and guide the deceased across that same river, an entire domesticated animal, bred and kept for the express purpose of dying alongside its owner to serve as the escort into death, on a continent that never once made contact with the old world traditions we already examined. The pattern does not stop at 2 echoes. In China, the tradition of the underworld bureaucracy names 2 spirits, Hei Wuchang and Bai Wuchang, the Black Guard and the White Guard of Impermanence, who are dispatched from the courts of the underworld, specifically to escort the souls of the dying to judgment. One of them traditionally shown holding a chain to bind the reluctant, functioning less as a dog in body, but occupying precisely the psychopomp office, the fetcher and escort, that the canine guardians filled elsewhere. In the folklore of Wales, at the far western edge of the old Celtic world, the Tuath and Nen, the hounds of the other world, are described as spectral white dogs with blood-red ears, running across the night sky under the command of a lord of the dead. And to hear their baying was to know that a death was imminent. The hounds themselves acting as harbingers and collectors of souls departing the world of the living. Related hunts appear across the folklore of England, Germany, and Scandinavia under different names, the wild hunt riding through winter storms with its own pack of spectral hounds, a tradition recorded independently by folklorists in region after region of Northern Europe with no single fixed point of origin. Farther east, in Japan, a different but related figure appears in the Inugami, a spirit created through a specific and ritualized sacrifice of a dog, and bound afterward to serve and protect its summoner, a being whose ferocious loyalty was said to follow its household so closely across the line between life and death that families who kept one required special rites to keep it from claiming one of their own. Norse mythology places a hound named Garma at the gate of Hell's realm, the land of the dishonored dead, described as blood-stained and howling, chained before a cave called Nipperhellir at the entrance to the underworld, so that his baying serves as the alarm that the end of the world has finally begun. The Norse tradition gives him a fate no other guardian on tonight's list receives, because the mythology's own account of the final battle, Ragnarok, names him as one of the handful of beings important enough to have a personal opponent, fated to fight the god Tyr in the last battle and kill him even as he is killed in turn, a guardian dog written not merely into the architecture of death, but into the closing chapter of the entire cosmos. Add to this list the many smaller, regionally documented traditions folklorists have catalogued across Slavic villages, Central Asian steppe cultures, and the indigenous nations of North America, each one placing a dog, a wolf, or a wolf-like spirit at the boundary of death, sometimes as a devourer, sometimes as a guide, sometimes as both at once. In West Africa, among the Yoruba, the dog stands as the sacred animal of Ogun, the Orisha who opens roads and clears paths through danger. and Yoruba funerary and divination practice treats the dog as an intermediary, capable of moving between the world of the living and the world of the spirits, a role distinct in its details from the old world guardians, but built from the identical intuition that this particular animal is the one already qualified to walk where humans cannot easily follow. Serious ethnographic surveys of world death mythology tally the total number of documented cultures with a canine guardian of the dead at 40 or more, a figure repeated often enough in comparative mythology literature that it has become something close to a standing count. Now sit with what that means. Egypt did not borrow Anubis from Greece, because Egyptian religion is provably older than the Greek myths in their developed form, with jackal-headed funerary deities appearing in Egyptian tomb art and texts more than 2,000 years before the earliest surviving Greek poetry. The Aztecs could not have borrowed Xolotl from Egypt, from Greece, or from India, because no plausible route of contact between Mesoamerica and the Old World has ever been established for the relevant period, and the belief is attested in sources describing practices that predate any European arrival on the continent. The Chinese underworld bureaucracy developed inside its own philosophical and folk tradition, with essentially no early contact with Indo-European death myth, drawing instead on a native cosmology of courts and clerks and ledgers that looks nothing like Greek or Persian mythology in any other respect except this one recurring detail. These are not cousins sharing a grandmother's ring. These are strangers who have never met, arriving independently at the identical idea, a dog standing at the edge of death, deciding who passes and who does not. If a detective found the same fingerprint at 40 separate crime scenes with no possible connection between the perpetrators, the fingerprint itself would become the case, the evidence no longer pointing outward at 40 different explanations, but inward at whatever single thing all 40 scenes had in common. So we have to ask what it is about this particular animal that made so many unconnected human societies choose it, again and again, for the single most important job any mythology has to fill. Layer 3. Why the dog? The answer, when you look for it honestly, does not require anything supernatural at all, and that is precisely what makes it so persuasive. Consider what a dog actually was to nearly every early human society on Earth. It was, in the overwhelming majority of cultures that developed this myth, the very first animal humanity ever domesticated, a partnership so old that genetic evidence traces the split between wolf and dog back tens of thousands of years, long before agriculture, long before cities, long before any of the civilizations in tonight's file existed in any form. The dog was already, in ordinary daily life, the guide who walked ahead of the hunter into unknown territory, the guard who stood at the boundary of the camp and decided who could approach and who could not, and the companion whose loyalty was observed to outlast even death itself, since dogs were noted across countless cultures for lingering at the graves of their owners. A being that already served as guide, guard, and mourner in life was the obvious candidate for a mythology in search of a guide, a guard, and a mourner for the journey after life. The mourner role in particular was not an abstraction to the people who built these myths. Across cultures with no connection to one another, observers recorded the same behavior and drew the same conclusion from it, that a dog would remain at the grave of its owner long after every human mourner had gone home, refusing food, refusing to be led away, as if loyalty itself did not recognize the boundary that death was supposed to enforce. A society that had watched that happen, generation after generation, did not need a theologian to explain why the same animal belonged at the threshold in the myth as well. There is also a harder, more uncomfortable layer beneath this same observation. In the ancient world, before formal burial practices were universal, dogs were also, quite literally, the scavengers of the dead, present at battlefields, at exposed burial grounds, at the edges of any place where death occurred in the open. A society that has watched dogs stand at the literal threshold between the living world and the decomposing bodies of the dead does not need a leap of imagination to place a dog at the mythological threshold as well. The animal was already doing the job. The myth simply gave it a name, a set of eyes, sometimes 4 instead of 2, and a formal appointment. There is a third reason, quieter than the first 2, and it has less to do with what dogs did and more to do with what dogs are. Unlike almost any other animal available to early human societies, the dog occupies a genuinely ambiguous category, neither fully wild nor fully tame, neither wholly part of the human world nor wholly outside it. A cow or a sheep belongs entirely inside the boundary of domestic life. A wolf or a lion belongs entirely outside it. The dog alone stands with one paw in each world, capable of living beside the hearth, and capable, if released, of returning to something closer to its wild ancestor. Anthropologists studying the symbolism of liminal creatures, beings that belong to no single category, and therefore seem suited to guard the seams between categories, have long noted that thresholds in mythology are disproportionately assigned to animals exactly like this, creatures that are neither one thing nor the other, and are for that reason trusted to stand at the border where one thing becomes another. Death itself is the ultimate threshold, the boundary between being and not being, between the world of the living and whatever comes after, and a species that had spent its entire relationship with humanity occupying exactly this kind of in-between status was, in a sense, already qualified for the position before any myth ever wrote the job description down. And once you notice the dog, a second pattern sits directly beneath it in nearly every one of these 40 traditions, because the guardian is rarely just a guardian. Look again at the job descriptions we have gathered tonight. Anubis does not simply block the gate, he weighs the heart. Yama's dogs do not simply guard the road. Yama himself, their master, sits as judge over the dead who arrive. The Chinvat Bridge does not merely need crossing. It narrows or widens based on the moral weight of the soul attempting it. The Chinese guards do not simply fetch the dying. They escort them to a court where their deeds are read and judged. Guarding, in this pattern, is never separable from judging. The gate is never simply a door. It is a scale. Notice too how often the scale is literal rather than metaphorical. The Egyptian ceremony places an actual balance in the hall of judgment, the heart on one side, a feather on the other, watched over by the god Thoth, recording the result while the canine guardian stands nearby, ready to see the failed soul devoured. The Chinvat Bridge performs the identical function through architecture instead of an instrument, the crossing itself widening for the righteous and narrowing to nothing for the wicked, so that the bridge becomes the scale, weighing the traveler by whether the traveler can physically stand on it at all. Two civilizations with no contact between them independently decided that judgment at the gate of death needed to be rendered visible, made into a physical event with a physical outcome, rather than left as an invisible decree, and in both cases they stationed the same species of animal beside the mechanism to see the verdict enforced. Across 40 unconnected cultures, humanity appears to have independently insisted on the same two-part architecture for its underworld, a threshold that must be physically crossed, and a judgment that determines whether the crossing succeeds, with the same loyal, watchful animal stationed at the exact point where those two requirements meet. So gather the evidence and lay it out the way the file demands. Part of tonight's pattern is a documented family, 3 related languages carrying one inherited myth eastward and westward from a common ancestor. No mystery at all once you know where to look. Only the ordinary traceable drift of culture along the branches of a family tree. But the larger part of tonight's pattern is not a family at all. It is a room full of strangers. Egypt, Mesoamerica, China, the Celtic edge of Europe, West Africa, and dozens of smaller traditions. Besides, none of them related to the others. None of them capable of borrowing from the rest, each one independently arriving at a dog, standing at a gate, deciding who may pass into death and who may not. You can explain that convergence, as we have tonight, through the practical logic of what a dog already meant to early human life. The guide, the guard, the mourner, the presence already found wherever death occurred. Watching over the living long enough that watching over the dead required no leap of imagination at all. That explanation is sound, and it very likely accounts for most of what we have found. But explaining why a pattern exists is not the same as explaining why it feels the way it does when you lay all 40 examples side by side on the same table at once. The same silhouette recurring in language after unrelated language, and the honest observer has to admit that something in the human mind, faced with the single most universal and most frightening fact of its existence, kept reaching across every ocean and every unconnected century, for the same steady, watchful shape to stand at the door. This entry is sealed. Every gate needs a keeper, and every civilization that has ever feared death has hired the same one. The Codex returns.